I thought my life was perfect. Married to the CEO's son, running campaigns that made the company millions. Then, on our anniversary, an email popped up. Your position has been terminated. No explanation, just those cold words. I later learned they replaced me with the CEO's niece, someone who had never worked a day in marketing. They called me just a wife. They didn't know every campaign they used was mine, legally mine. That day, I decided, if they wanted me gone, I'd make sure they'd pay me for the rest of their lives, and I meant it. I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing, sunlight pouring across silk sheets. My morning routine had become a kind of curated performance. Coffee in a white ceramic cup, soft jazz in the background, a quick shot of my work-from-home desk for Instagram. People online thought I was living a dream. In some ways, I was. A 3-story home with glass walls overlooking the city, a husband who wore tailored suits like they were made for him, and a position at my in-laws' real estate empire that gave me influence and purpose. I believed I'd earned my place there. The video I posted that morning, A Day in My Life, got thousands of likes before noon. Clips of me stepping into the marble-floored office, exchanging polite smiles with my mother-in-law typing away at my laptop. On screen, her hand rested lightly on my shoulder. Off screen, her grip was firm, her nails pressing in just enough to remind me she was in control. Her compliments always came with an edge. You do look professional today, much better than last week. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was oversensitive. But in the boardroom later that week, the mask slipped. I was halfway through presenting a new campaign, charts glowing on the projector, months of work condensed into 10 minutes, when one of the senior directors leaned toward another and said, just loud enough for me to hear, "We don't need her, she's just a wife." The words cut through the room like a blade. I stumbled for half a second, forced my voice steady, and finished the presentation while my heart pounded in my ears. I glanced at my husband across the table. He didn't meet my eyes. That night, we celebrated our anniversary at a rooftop restaurant. The city glittered below us, wine glasses clinked, and for a moment I thought maybe I was wrong about everything. Then my phone vibrated, an email from HR. Your position has been terminated, effective immediately. No reason, no discussion, just those cold, precise words. I didn't cry. Not there, not in front of him. I slid the phone into my bag and finished my glass of wine. Inside, something cold began to settle. The next morning, while the city woke around me, I sat at the kitchen table scrolling through internal memos that had been accidentally sent to my personal email. That was how I learned the truth. My role had been reassigned to the CEO's niece, a 23-year-old with no experience in marketing, whose main qualification was sharing the family name. It should have ended there. I was out, and they were moving on. But then I noticed something in the quarterly reports, numbers tied to my last campaign. It was still running, still earning, and every piece of it, every tagline, every image, was legally mine. I had filed the copyrights myself. My name alone sat on those registrations. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me still, like the quiet before a storm. I knew better than to confront them outright. My in-laws thrived on open conflict. It was their home turf. I needed to make them believe I was gone, irrelevant, defeated. So I played my part. I posted beach photos on Instagram, tagged self-care, let the gossip spread that I was taking time off to focus on family. Behind closed doors, I backed up every file I'd ever created, stored copies of internal emails, and started a meticulous record of every unauthorized use of my work. I stopped answering calls from the office. I let my mother-in-law's messages go unanswered. I didn't want them to think I was planning anything. One afternoon, when the house was empty, I went to the study. In the corner stood a heavy walnut cabinet, its lower drawer fitted with a lock. I retrieved the key from the back of a desk drawer and opened it. Inside was a stack of important documents: property deeds, trust paperwork, insurance policies. I slid my own folder into the mix, certified copyright registrations for every campaign I had ever authored at the company. I placed them in chronological order, each page stamped with the date and my signature. As I closed the drawer, I ran my fingers along the smooth wood. This wasn't just paper, it was leverage. It was a quiet promise that they had underestimated me for the last time. When I locked the cabinet and tucked the key back where it belonged, I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not anger, not even satisfaction. It was anticipation. They thought the game was over. They didn't know it had just begun. I became someone else online. My Instagram turned into a parade of late breakfasts, windswept beach walks, and blurry sunset shots. Captions were light and unbothered, taking time to breathe, focusing on what matters. I made sure people in the company saw them, old colleagues, my husband, even my mother-in-law. The message was clear. Olivia has checked out. It worked. Invitations to meetings stopped coming. Gossip began to swirl. She's done with the corporate world. She just wants to relax now. But behind the glossy veneer of idleness, my days were filled with something entirely different. I sat in front of my laptop for hours, diving into webinars on digital intellectual property law, studying how blockchain could lock ownership in ways contracts sometimes failed to. I read case studies of brands that had been stolen, diluted, and then reclaimed by the original creators. Each story sharpened my focus. I bought notebooks, 3 of them, each labeled Assets, Strategy, Execution. In Assets, I listed every campaign, concept, and piece of creative work I had produced, noting registration numbers and filing dates. In Strategy, I mapped potential moves, licensing agreements, partnerships, content syndication. In Execution, I began crafting timelines, identifying the tools and allies I would need. One afternoon, I clicked Submit on a set of forms that transferred ownership of all my intellectual property from myself as an individual to a new entity. A limited liability company I had quietly registered under a nondescript name. The screen blinked, loading, then displayed, Ownership transfer complete. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of the moment. The campaigns were no longer just mine. They now belonged to a structure I controlled, one designed to protect and monetize them far beyond the reach of my in-laws. I didn't celebrate. Not yet. The real work was just starting. The next step was creation without visibility. I founded a marketing firm with no public record linking it to me. On paper, the owner was a friend from college who now lived across the country. She had no ties to my family, no presence in the local business scene. Behind the scenes, every concept, every pitch, every strategy came from my desk. I called it, privately, the Shadow brand. Its public face was sleek but minimal. No oversized claims, just results. We launched our first campaign for a mid-tier retail chain, and within weeks, sales spiked 27%. The industry began to whisper, "Who's behind this firm?" No one had an answer. That was when I set my sights on the biggest move of all, approaching the fiercest competitor of my in-laws' company. I didn't walk into their offices. I didn't send a personal email. Instead, my business partner made the introduction, presenting our portfolio without names, only data, conversion rates, revenue growth, viral reach, numbers too good to ignore. When their board approved the proposal, I pulled something from my assets notebook, one of my most successful campaigns from my old job, stripped of branding but intact in its structure and visuals. Legally, I could license it. Morally, it was mine to use however I wanted. The deal was signed quickly. The competitor paid a premium for exclusivity, and part of the contract included perpetual monthly licensing fees as long as they used the campaign. The sum was more than comfortable. It was a statement. Then came the second twist, the one that almost made me laugh. My business partner called one evening, her voice tinged with disbelief. "You'll never guess who signed the final approval," she said. When she told me, I sat in silence for a beat. The name wasn't just familiar, it was burned into my memory. My father-in-law, the CEO himself, had authorized the payment. He had no idea that the firm he'd just wired over $300,000 to was mine. I imagined the scene. Him in his office, pen in hand, skimming the contract without a second thought, confident he was investing in a strategic partnership that would strengthen his company. In reality, he was paying me. Paying for work they had once taken without credit. Paying for the very ideas they had dismissed when they labeled me just a wife. I closed my laptop slowly, the edges of a smile forming. There was no rush to reveal anything. The beauty of this was in the silence. They would keep paying, month after month, never suspecting who was on the other end of the transaction. And I would keep building, brick by invisible brick, until the foundation they stood on began to crack beneath them. When the next licensing deal came across my desk, I added a single line to the contract, a clause so ordinary it almost disappeared in the legal language. It required that, in any public or internal use of my campaigns, the following words be displayed in clear type. Licensed from Olivia. Not my company name, not my partner's, my name. At first, I wasn't sure they would agree, but they signed without hesitation, treating it like an inconsequential detail. They didn't realize the clause would be the spark. Within weeks, brochures, billboards, and glossy real estate packets bore my name at the bottom in small but undeniable letters. The first time I saw it in the wild, I was in a coffee shop. A man at the next table flipped open a property magazine, and there it was. My campaign, my design, my name printed under the image. He lingered on the page, tapping it with his finger. "That's the one everyone's talking about," he said to his friend. I sipped my coffee and said nothing, but inside, something like electricity moved through me. Soon it was everywhere. The company's social media posts, their press releases, even the backdrops at their events carried my name. I wasn't hidden anymore, not in the way they'd planned. They had unwittingly turned me into a public figure. Then the call came. A journalist from a leading business magazine wanted to profile me for an article on the year's most impactful campaigns. She spoke as if she'd been trying to track me down for months, her tone warm, insistent. "We'd love to hear your perspective, Olivia. You've reshaped the market." I agreed to meet her, choosing a quiet rooftop cafe far from the glass towers of my in-laws' empire. As she asked her questions, I kept my answers measured, never revealing more than I intended. The article ran 2 weeks later. The headline was flattering but pointed, "The mind behind the market's hottest real estate campaigns." It didn't take long for the shift to begin. Clients who had been loyal to my in-laws for decades started calling my partner's office, asking to work directly with the mysterious firm behind the campaigns. Contracts were canceled or quietly allowed to expire. My shadow brand was taking their market share one deal at a time. In their boardroom, the tension must have been rising, though I only heard whispers at first, through friends, through the industry grapevine. My mother-in-law had apparently begun to suspect that the anonymous firm might not be so anonymous after all. Her suspicion turned into action. She hired a private investigator, a man known for digging into hidden business ties and peeling back corporate layers. I knew because one of his inquiries landed on the desk of my accountant, who, loyal to me, tipped me off immediately. It was only a matter of time before the threads connected, and they did. Sooner than I expected. I was in my study when my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. No words, just a link. I hesitated, then tapped it. The video loaded. My mother-in-law, in a tailored navy dress, standing in her office. On the desk in front of her was one of my licensing contracts. Her face was set in an expression I knew too well. Pure, calculated rage. She picked up the contract and, without looking at the camera, began to tear it slowly, the sound of paper ripping loud in the microphone. She didn't stop until the pages were shredded in her hands. Then she looked up, straight into the lens, and said, "She thinks she's clever." The clip ended abruptly. It had been recorded without her knowledge and leaked onto a small but vicious corner of the internet, an anonymous business gossip channel. Within hours, it was circulating in private industry groups. People watched, commented, speculated. Some laughed, others warned of a coming war. I watched it 3 times, each time feeling the same mix of anticipation and clarity. The game was no longer in the shadows. She knew, and if she knew, it meant they were preparing to move against me. But they still didn't understand one thing. The long con was already too far along to stop. The leaked video didn't rattle me. If anything, it told me they were finally seeing the board for what it was, a game they could no longer control. That night, I made a call I'd been saving for exactly this moment. "Ready to step back in?" I asked when the voice on the other end picked up. The answer was a low laugh. "I've been ready for a year." We met in a quiet corner of a downtown hotel bar, far from the offices where our names still lingered like ghost stories. He was the former CFO of my in-laws' company, a man they'd once paraded as a symbol of trust and stability, until they'd orchestrated a scandal to remove him, painting him as incompetent. I'd believed their version back then. Later, I learned the truth. He'd refused to cook the books on a deal that would have lined their pockets at the expense of shareholders. I slid a folder across the table. Inside was my plan. Not just the campaigns, but the partnerships, licensing structures, and market data showing exactly how we could take 35% of their market share within 18 months. He flipped through the pages in silence, his eyes catching on certain numbers, certain names. "This is surgical," he said finally. "They won't see it coming until they've already bled out." "That's the idea," I replied. We signed the partnership agreement right there on the bar's polished wood. The handshake that followed wasn't celebratory. It was ceremonial, a pact. Within weeks, the machinery began to move. Through the Shadow brand and his network of trusted contacts, we secured contracts with developers, agents, and investors who had once been fixtures in my in-laws' empire. Each deal came with airtight clauses ensuring exclusive use of our campaigns, locking my in-laws out of markets they had dominated for decades. The first public blow came quietly. A luxury condo launch they had hyped for months, stalled at the last moment. Their marketing materials were pulled after a cease and desist landed on their legal team's desk, signed by my attorney, citing infringement on my copyrighted visuals. It happened again and again, a suburban housing project, a commercial lease promotion. Each time they were forced to either scrap the launch or pay steep licensing fees to use the very campaigns they'd once stolen outright. Inside their glass tower headquarters, panic must have been setting in. Out here, in the world they couldn't control, my name was gaining a different weight. A month later, a glossy cover hit the stands. Forbes. Across it, my face. The headline read, "The IP Queen. How One Woman Rewrote the Rules of Real Estate Marketing." The article was everything they would hate, detailing my rise, my control over high-value campaigns, my partnerships. It painted me as a visionary in a space they had long considered theirs alone. I didn't hide the magazine. I left copies in cafes, slid one across the table to a broker I knew would report back to them, even mailed a signed copy to an old colleague still working in their office. The calls started coming in after that, new clients, potential investors, people who wanted to be aligned with the name that was now reshaping the industry. Then one evening, my phone lit up with a number I hadn't seen in months. I stared at it for a moment, letting it ring once, twice, before I answered. Olivia. My father-in-law's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, strain, maybe even desperation. "We need to talk, in person." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked out over the city from my apartment window, the skyline glowing against the night. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm. "About business, I assume." There was a pause. "About how we can end this before it goes any further." The line went quiet after that, the weight of his words hanging between us. I smiled to myself. This was the call I'd been waiting for. Power changes the air around you. It makes rooms feel smaller, voices quieter. In the weeks after my father-in-law's call, I saw the shift everywhere. people leaning in when I spoke, doors opening without me asking. But power casts shadows. I started hearing stories. An assistant I'd once worked with had been let go when a project of theirs collapsed under my cease and desist. A junior designer, bright and eager, was suddenly jobless after my in-laws lost a major client to the shadow brand. These weren't my enemies. They were collateral damage. I told myself they would find better places to work, with people who valued them. But the truth weighed heavier than I liked to admit. Then one morning, a letter arrived in a plain white envelope. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. Dear Olivia, I don't know if you remember me. I was part of the marketing team 3 years ago. When I lost my job last month, I thought it was the worst thing that could happen. But I remembered what you once told me. Own your ideas, and no one can take them from you. I started my own small agency. I have 2 clients already. Thank you for giving me the courage to try. I read it twice, then set it down. Not all consequences were losses. Some were beginnings. Still, the next email that hit my inbox shifted my attention back to the battlefield. A multinational conglomerate known for swallowing up smaller firms wanted to buy the shadow brand outright. The offer was staggering, enough to retire twice over. But what caught my eye was the language. Full transfer of all intellectual property, exclusive rights in perpetuity. It was too aggressive, too fast. I asked my partner to dig quietly. What she found pulled the ground from beneath me. The conglomerate was a shell. On paper, it was based overseas. In reality, the funding traced back to a holding company my in-laws controlled. They weren't trying to invest in me. They were trying to reclaim everything I'd taken. I played it cool, stalling with polite but vague replies. In the meantime, I called my attorney, a man who had handled my contracts since I'd started the shadow brand. I explained the situation, expecting his usual calm assurance. Instead, his responses felt off. He didn't seem surprised by the conglomerate's interest. He kept steering the conversation toward strategic exits and minimizing legal exposure. A bad feeling rooted in my gut. I asked him to send over the documents he'd been preparing on my behalf. When they arrived, I read them line by line. There it was, in the fine print, language that could effectively void my ownership of several key campaigns if control of the company changed hands. It was a trap. The only person who could have written it that way was my lawyer, and the only reason to do it was if he'd been bought. I confronted him the next morning. He didn't deny it. They made me an offer I couldn't refuse, he said, not meeting my eyes. You've made powerful enemies, Olivia. Sometimes it's better to let go. I walked out before he could finish, my mind already turning. Betrayal was nothing new to me, but this was different. This was someone I'd chosen, someone I'd trusted to guard the fortress from the inside. By the end of the week, the papers were filed. The conglomerate, my in-laws, were suing for control of my intellectual property. Their claim hinged on the very clauses my lawyer had inserted into my contracts. The trial date was set. When I read the court notice, I felt the familiar stillness settle over me, the kind I'd felt when they fired me, the kind that meant the storm was coming, and I was ready to meet it. Only this time, the outcome wouldn't just decide who owned a handful of campaigns. It would decide the future of everything I'd built, and whether the shadow brand would live or die. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. I walked past rows of suited attorneys and curious onlookers, my heels striking against the marble floor with a rhythm that kept my pulse steady. I could have hired another lawyer, but after what had happened, I decided no one would tell my story better than I could. Inside the courtroom, my in-laws sat at the plaintiff's table, their faces carefully composed. My former lawyer wasn't there, likely tucked away somewhere far from the blast radius. Their legal team was a wall of gray suits and unreadable eyes, armed with stacks of documents they hoped would dismantle me. When the judge called my name, I stood. My opening statement was simple. This case isn't about business rivalry. It's about ownership, of ideas, of work, of identity. and the law is clear. Then I began. I presented printed emails where executives acknowledged my authorship of the campaigns in question. I walked the court through dated contracts, each stamped and signed, showing my intellectual property was registered under my name before the shadow brand even existed. I projected internal memos, ones they never thought I kept, that proved they knew my ownership rights and used the materials anyway. But the most devastating blow came when I opened my laptop in front of the judge. I pulled up a blockchain ledger, time-stamped, immutable, logging every time one of my campaigns had been deployed. Each record matched the periods during which my in-laws had profited from them without consent. There was no way to alter it, no way to claim it was fabricated. Their attorneys shifted in their seats. My mother-in-law's hand tightened on her pen until her knuckles whitened. The cross-examination was brutal. They tried to paint me as vindictive, as someone who had sabotaged their business out of spite. I didn't flinch. I didn't sabotage anything, I said evenly. I created work. I protected it. And when you took it without asking, I made you pay the price you agreed to in writing. The trial lasted 3 days. On the final morning, the judge's voice was steady as she read the verdict. The intellectual property belonged solely to me. But she wasn't finished. The court found that my in-laws' continued unauthorized use of my work constituted willful infringement. Her ruling, they were to pay me 3 times the amount they had already paid in licensing fees over the last year. The sum was staggering, enough to make even the stoic CEO blink. I didn't look at them. I didn't need to. I could feel the weight of the moment settle over the room. As I stepped outside into the sunlight, microphones and cameras surged forward. A reporter shouted a question about what I'd say to women in business who doubted their own strength. I didn't think. The words just came. Never underestimate a wife. By nightfall, it was everywhere. Hashtags, headlines, stitched into videos of women across the world reclaiming their work, their worth. I hadn't planned for it to go viral, but I understood why it had. With the lawsuit behind me, I turned my attention to something I'd been sketching in the margins of my notebooks for months, a space where women could learn what I had learned the hard way. The Phoenix Institute launched quietly at first, a digital academy offering courses on intellectual property, brand building, and negotiation tactics. I built it for entrepreneurs, for creatives, for anyone who had been told they didn't belong in the rooms where decisions were made. Enrollment exploded within weeks. Former colleagues signed up. Strangers from halfway around the world sent messages about how the lessons were changing their approach to business. I hired a team of women, designers, marketers, educators, many of whom had once been casualties of corporate power games, like the ones I'd survived. But the work wasn't just digital. I spoke at conferences, consulted for startups, and guest lectured at universities. My name was no longer just a footnote on the bottom of a brochure. It was a signal, a warning to some, an invitation to others. 6 months later, I stepped onto the stage of a TED Talk event. The lights were warm, the room filled with faces waiting to hear me. I began where my journey had started, not with the betrayal, but with the belief that I didn't have a choice. I told them about the firing, the campaigns, the silent war. I told them that choice is always there. You just have to be willing to claim it. When I finished, the applause started like rain and built to a standing ovation. It wasn't the noise that moved me, but the sight of people, many of them women, looking at me not with pity, but with recognition. Backstage, my phone buzzed. A message from an unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. "We might need your help." The signature was simple. My former CEO, my father-in-law. I stared at it for a long moment, then slipped the phone back into my bag. Outside, the next speaker was being introduced. I smiled, not because of the message, but because for the first time in years, my future didn't depend on their need for me. And that was the real victory.